In this video, we're going to introduce the JpaRepository class in Spring Boot and then see examples of using it. JpaRepository is an extension of Spring's repository interface, and this class is specifically written to work with JPA. Its interface is very similar to that of CRUD repository that we saw in a previous video, which makes it familiar to use, and it supports all the JPA implementations transparently. If we want to make use of the JpaRepository class, then we will need this dependency, the Spring Data JPA. And if we've already got an existing project and we want to add that dependency in, this is how we could do it. Here's an example of a JpaRepository. As you can see, it's formed in a very similar way to the CRUD repository that we saw previously. And instead of extending CRUD repository, we're extending JpaRepository. The really important thing here is that the value type must be a designated JPA entity class. And that's it. JPA will make sure that each book object will automatically have a collection of related copy objects, and each of those copy objects will have the correct reference back to the book object. And this really simplifies data management. Here's a comparison between using a CRUD repository and a JPA repository. These two methods do exactly the same thing, but when we're using a CRUD repository, we have to form ourselves that object relationship between the book and the copies, whereas the JPA does that automatically. So we can just call the method, get the book, and it will be given to us along with all of the copy objects that relate to that book. And so JPA removes the need for some of the boilerplate code. And also, it reduces the code length. In this example, you don't really need to see the detail of it, just look at the number of methods. In comparison with JpaRepository, we've just got the borrow copy method. In other words, all of these methods here are all about managing the formation of relationships in the object model, whereas JPA does all of that automatically for us. So let's take a look at the JpaRepository demo. The first thing I want to do is to illustrate to you the advantage of using JPA in terms of the number of classes involved. On the right here, we have got the use of CRUD repository, and on the left, the use of JpaRepository. And you can see if we just look at the book package, in the CRUD repository, we needed a book copy repository, which we no longer need. Correspondingly, in the entities, we no longer need the book copy view because that's provided for us by the JPA entity classes. So we've been able to save at least 2 classes just by making use of JpaRepository. So let's take a look at some of the classes here. We've already seen the book class. I've also added in another method which is not related to the JPA but is needed for the purposes of the application. These are the fields that will hold database values, and there will be corresponding get and set methods because of those Lombok annotations. And I'm just adding in an extra method that will return the size of the copies collection, which is populated by JPA. We've already seen the copy class and the copy status class. Those are the 3 entity classes. In the book repository, all we have to do is to make sure that the value of the JpaRepository is an entity class, similarly with copy repository and also the copy status repository. When we want to use these repositories, we look in the book service and we can get a summary of all books. We've seen that already, and this has been greatly simplified because we no longer have to provide the boilerplate code to establish the relationship between the entity objects. JPA does all of that for us. And we can do something similar for getting a book's details. And again, we don't need to obtain the copies separately as we did when using CRUD repository because JpaRepository does that automatically. In the copy service, we can do things a little bit differently now. We know that the copy status service will allow us to get a copy status object, and we can then store that. Now, because we're using JPA, we can store very easily a copy status object instead of just storing the ID. Now, when we were using the CRUD repository, we were just comparing IDs. But now that we're using a JPA repository, we can get the actual copy status object. And later on, just down here a little bit, instead of comparing the IDs of the foreign key and the primary key that came out of the database via CRUD repository, what we're doing now is comparing the actual objects. And that's why in copy status, I put in this Lombok annotation for equals and hash code. That will generate automatically the equals method and the hash code method. The equals method allows us to do this comparison between the status object that we get from the copy and the status object that we got from the copy status service. And so our code is becoming more and more object-oriented simply because we're using the JPA repository instead of the CRUD repository. Like we did with the CRUD repository, we can just call the JPA repository's save method, passing in an entity object. And that repository will then use the entity manager to store an instance of that in the database. Now, if in the database that copy object does not exist, the entity manager will insert it into the database table. If the object already exists, then save will update the existing row. Because of the architecture that we're using, the controllers don't change at all. It's just the book service changing because we have changed the repositories. The repositories now use JPA, they do a lot more, therefore there's less boilerplate code needed in the services. But the controllers are completely isolated from those changes. And that's one of the powerful benefits of really good architecture in our applications. You can download this, there's a link in the description, and take a few minutes to examine the code and make sure you understand how it works. So if you do some more background reading on the JPA repository, also maybe a couple of Google searches why you should use ORM and why you should not use ORM. There are some interesting discussions about that, and it would be good for you to see the opposing views and to form your own opinion.